Live? You're live.
Yeah, I can tell we're live. We're live. Hi, everyone. It's now 1 p.m. here in Charlottesville, Virginia. And welcome to our final Google Hangout, our final live session for the course. We're coming towards the end of week 4 of the course. I don't know about you guys, but it's gone by really fast for me. And it's been very exciting and active. And so before we kind of dive into your questions and hopefully have some of the participants join us live on the feed, I wanted to just say, first and foremost, and I'm going to end with this note too, but I wanted just to say thank you for the community, the entire group, all of our thousands and thousands of students. What a wonderful, wonderful activity and community we've created together. The forums have been active, questions have been asked and responded. People are very quick and complimentary of each other, and it's just been really exciting to see the positive vibe that we've been able to maintain throughout the 4 weeks. I wanted to thank Leslie, who's been doing a great job. A lot of you have thanked her directly, and I encourage you to continue to do that, to make sure that any technical issues get resolved, to alert me and the rest of the staff to any issues either with the Coursera platform or even with the content itself, and help me and support me in providing the material to you. So thank you to Leslie again and again and again. So we have a whole list of questions. Leslie, you wanted to jump in there?
Hi, Yael.
Hi, how are you?
We do have a list of questions here. If you're ready to jump into them, let's go ahead.
Yeah, let me just explain. Before we do that, I'm just going to explain what the idea for today is. And then if things develop during the session, people will be less surprised. The idea for today, and hopefully the technicalities are getting sorted in the background as we speak. The idea for our session today is that I'm not the only one here answering questions live, is that we have a handful of participants from the course, individuals who have been highly active or have a special expertise that were willing to come and join us live. And so if you see faces pop up in the Google environment, you should be able to hear them from the audio perspective, and you should be able to see them. And hopefully if they join us, you'll understand why they're joining. And as they join and come on board, I will give them a few minutes to introduce themselves, tell us where they're from, and also they'll help me answer some of your questions, just to create a richer and more diverse conversation. So that's the plan for today. As we've been doing in the past with these Google Hangouts, some of these questions were posted on the course platform. So thank you for those who have used the forums to post questions, and we will be marching through those. Some of the questions are being fed live to Twitter. So if you do have a question now, if you're watching us, feel free to use the hashtag PMOT, and we will pick it up and hopefully have time to discuss it. We'll probably be running around half an hour, maybe 45 minutes, depending on how many questions we have. So join us, stay with us, ask us your questions to make sure that we end on a high note. This wonderful 4 weeks end on a high note and get all your questions answered. So with that, I think, Leslie, I'm ready to start marching through some questions, and let's see how it goes.
All right. So a few weeks ago, we had a thread come up in the forums. It is called "What is the Critical Path?" It's in the video lectures forum. So we talk about the critical path in week 2, but I think it would be good to just go through the critical path a little bit again and touch on some of the questions that came up in that thread.
Okay, so I'll do my best to kind of highlight some key points about the critical path, why it's important, how we calculate it, how we use it. And I encourage anybody who has questions about the critical path that was covered in the middle of week 2 to go back and to either review the videos again, review the supplementary software videos that also help explain a little bit the critical path, and also follow the thread that Leslie mentioned, because the participants have done a fantastic job providing a whole slew of examples and discussing those examples in quite a lot of detail to make sure that everybody understands the mechanics behind the calculations. So from me, this is my spiel about the critical path. The critical path is a very specific term used in project management associated with the duration of the project. So sometimes when we hear about a critical path, we think to ourselves, it's the most important activities. Well, you could think of it that way, but the technical term, and this is important to understand, the term that we use in project management language, if you open a project management book or if you talk to project managers, the technical term critical path is very specific. And it means those tasks that form the longest path in a project, assuming that everything starts as soon as possible. So assuming that we start our project as soon as we can and the tasks start when they can, the longest path will determine my project duration. And so that longest path is our critical path, and that is what determines the project duration. If there are any delays in each one of those, in any of those activities on the critical path, the project completion date will be delayed. So the importance of the critical path is because that is where delays will emerge. If any of the tasks along that path have a problem or experience delays, we will experience delays on a project level. Another reason that the critical path is important is because if we want to shorten our project, if we want to make our project finish sooner, or if we want to try and get it to finish sooner, again, we focus on the critical path. We identify tasks on it that we can shorten in terms of the duration, and that's where we will have some savings. There is no point investing time and effort shortening activities that are not on the critical path because it won't actually reduce the project completion time. So if you want the project manager to focus on sorry, if you want the project manager to focus on the activities that will impact the actual duration, then you want them to focus on the critical task activities. Bear in mind that if you start shortening those tasks, then you will might face a new critical path as you go along, and therefore you just have to be careful as you shorten the critical path. Every time you shorten an activity, every time you shorten the critical path, make sure that a new critical path didn't emerge. There was another question that came up that I spotted along the way in the discussion around what is the critical path, and that was, where do the actual estimations come from? Where do those project durations come from in the project plan in order to come up with the estimations for the actual critical path and for the entire project duration? That's a great question. Eliciting durations is hard. It's not always a trivial task, and sometimes the individuals who do the work don't really have a lot of experience or knowledge to tell you an accurate duration. So you have to be creative. You can ask multiple experts. You can ask people about their historical experiences in other projects. You can ask groups of individuals to brainstorm together to come up with an estimate. You can, in the Agile framework, sometimes they use what's called poker planning, which is a more interactive game to come up with an estimate for the amount of work that has to be done. And so there are methods to come up with the estimates and processes that you can take to improve the estimates that you derive. But it is definitely not a trivial task. So just to summarize, how do I come up with the estimates of the durations? I look at historical projects that I've been engaged in. I ask a whole bunch of experts that might have some related expertise. I ask individuals with different experiences. I consider other projects that might have similar traits. And I can create some social atmosphere that will allow me to elicit some unbiased set of opinions. And if I take all of these techniques together, I can try and come up with estimates for my durations. So hopefully that answered that question around the estimation. And I encourage you all, again, if you have questions around the critical path, to go ahead and read the forum discussions that follow through those points. I think, Leslie, that's it for the critical path.
All right, thank you, Yael. We had another question or a few questions about tornado diagrams. We discussed these diagrams in week 3.
Okay.
And we actually provided the example Excel file, which I think you are going to bring up and show everyone here in just a minute. So could you talk a little bit more about tornado diagrams and how the chart is created, and then how we determine the changes in project duration, minimum and maximum duration, and using the spreadsheet, just go through that a little bit.
Sure. So let's start. Let's actually start talking about the tornado diagrams when picking up on where I just ended around the critical path, because the question was associated with the critical path. How do I come up with project task durations or estimates for those durations? And so let's say I'm planning a project that has to do with a group of engineers, and I go and I meet with those engineers and I ask them about each one of the tasks in their plan, how long they think it's going to take them. They can give me a number, their best guess, or what they know from historical experience, and I can try and dig in a little bit more and ask them more questions like, if everything went as smooth as it can be, or if everything was just easier and simplified, how quickly could you finish? If you had a little bit of help from experts, if you learned this new piece of technology, how quickly could you finish this task? So maybe they could derive, or they could give me their minimum, their absolute optimistic estimate for how long a task would take. I also think that we would like in the process to ask them, well, what happens if something goes wrong? What happens if it just doesn't work? How long, realistically, what is the worst that can happen, and how long would it take you to finish this task under that worst case scenario? And try and push them on it, and try and really, encourage them to think pessimistically for a moment, so you get that real maximum duration. And once you have those numbers, not just their best guess, a single point estimate, but two numbers in addition to that, the minimum and the maximum, you're starting to think about ranges. And so if I flip, and I'm going to try and share here my, my screen so you see my spreadsheet. So if you look at my spreadsheet here, what I've done is that for each task in this example of a project, and you might recall this spreadsheet from the lecture videos and from the discussion boards and the spreadsheet that I shared, I have my little startup example with the 8 tasks. For each task, I came up with a likely duration, a most likely duration, which is my best guess. In addition to the most likely duration, I came up with a minimum duration. What is the quickest a task can finish if everything goes as smooth as it can be? And I came up with a maximum duration. What is the worst case scenario, a complete pessimistic perspective on how bad things could go from a duration perspective. And so once I have these 3 columns, I need to say to myself, well, what are the implications? What do these ranges do to my overall project duration? If a task has a huge duration, meaning if a task is uncertain, if it can swing from 1 week to 7 weeks, or from 2 weeks to 10 weeks, that's concerning on many levels. That's a big range in terms of my ability to predict what will happen in the future. I'm pretty uncertain around what will happen with this task. But maybe the implication for my overall project is not that big. Maybe that task isn't on the critical path, and therefore, even if it takes longer, nothing will happen to my overall project completion, and I can actually afford for that to happen. And so the idea behind the tornado is to say to myself, well, each one of these tasks has a variability, has a certain range it could take, from the minimum duration to the maximum duration. For instance, creative might take 3 weeks, but could last all the way to 7 weeks. How much do I care about that? How much does that hurt and affect my overall project completion? And so I need to test those numbers. I need to plug in 3, plug in 7, and see what happens to the critical path. Now, doing that manually, if you've drawn the critical path manually and you're working purely on paper and with paper and pen, that might be quite time consuming. If you do have the ability to work with a software program, even with Excel, which was the point of my demonstration, a software program like Excel, MS Project, Primavera, any of the project management tools for sure, would allow you to automate that process and to test those extremes much quicker. And so let me move over to the diagram here. And I hope you can see on your screen my my tornado diagram or my tornado chart here, in which I've done exactly that. I've taken each one of my tasks and I've plugged it into my spreadsheet and said, what happens when I change this number from the most likely to the minimum? What happens to the project completion when I change this estimate to the maximum? What is the swing? What is the range of duration for my overall project given the variability in the specific task? And so maybe I'll demonstrate it real quick here. So for instance, if now all of my tasks are set to the most likely value and I want to check the impact of my creative task, all I need to do is change this to 3, and I see that my overall project duration is 15. I can also change this to 7, and I can see that my project duration is now 19. So my overall project duration changes from 15 to 19 due to the variability in the first task. Now the key is that my spreadsheet is already set up to calculate the critical path. It is set up to calculate the project completion because I've calculated the slack along the way. So you would have to set that up for your project if you're working in an Excel-based environment. If you want to conduct this analysis in a more suitable project management environment, it shouldn't take you that long to set it up because all you need to do is just have your project in the software tool with the correct dependencies, and then you just vary the durations to test the impact on the overall project completion. Final word about the interpretation of the chart. So if I look here at my chart, at my tornado chart, how do I read the tornado chart? Well, the bars on the top, the widest, the longest, have the biggest impact on my project completion. The numbers on my x-axis represent that overall project completion time. In this case, it's in weeks. So in my figure that I'm looking at, finance is moving from 11 all the way to 17. So the project completion time is affected quite a bit by the finance variability. The earliest it will be completed is within 11 weeks, and the longest it might take is 17, because driven by the variability in the finance task. And this is assuming that I'm holding everything else at their most likely value. And so the interpretation of the tornado diagram is to really spot key drivers. We're only varying each task at a time, and so we're holding everything else constant. But it does tell me not to spend too much time on trying to gain more confidence, for instance, in the IT duration or the HR duration, or even the strategy and the marketing. While those tasks might have variability, they don't have a big impact on my project duration. That's it about tornado diagram. I hope that's clarified any confusions or difficulties. It is quite a specific tool, and it takes some time to get used to working with. But once you do, it is hugely insightful to focus your attention on key drivers of uncertainty as opposed to factors that might not affect your goals as much as you think they do. And so, Leslie, I'm going to unshare this.
Hold on, Yael. We had a question in the forum from Alexander about
Sure.
tornado diagrams. I think ours has just a handful of different activities in it, but Alexander was wondering, how does the tornado diagram change when you have more than 20, 50 activities that you need to incorporate?
Well, it becomes, of course, a lot bigger, but it would be a very similar format. What I've seen most typically when I see large projects, even projects with hundreds of tasks, that when you do this, when you plot these types of charts, you would be surprised at the relative low number of tasks that are the key drivers. So it would become like a very narrow tornado, meaning it starts fat on top, but very quickly tasks become less relevant. Now, it depends on the structure of the project itself as well. If I have a highly sequential project, meaning most of the tasks are done one after the other, as opposed to in parallel, then more tasks might have more of an effect on the overall project completion, because a sequential project is likely to have more projects on the critical path. If I have more tasks that are done in parallel, then we might see these shapes that I talk about, that there are some key activities that have variability that have a high effect on my project duration, but then the bulk of the tasks will not affect us as much. In the same sense that typically only a few tasks are actually critical, and most often you would be surprised at the number of those tasks. It's actually much fewer than you think in terms of the critical path. So hopefully that answers the question from Alexander. So I think we're done with the tornado. I see that Evgen joined us. Maybe Evgen, you can introduce yourself, and then we'll take some questions back and forth.
Everybody.
Tell us where you're dialing in from.
Yeah, I'm from Ukraine. I'm 28 years old. I have masters in economics and cybernetics. Right now, I'm working as corporate client manager, and I'm actually actively studying project management because of my current occupation, and I have ability to thank you, Yael, and thank you, Leslie, for such a wonderful course. And I don't know what else.
No, that's perfect. That's exactly what we wanted to hear. Not so much the thank you, of course, that's nice to hear, but where you're from and what you're doing and what brought you to the course. I believe Pinky has joined us as well, and we'll ask Pinky to introduce herself. Go ahead, Pinky.
Oh, hi. Had a little technical difficulty getting back on. But I'm Pinky Stewart, and I am in the Chicago, Illinois area. And I decided to join the course because I'd done program management, project management for a lot of years for a government-funded program, and just wanted to get an idea of the new technologies and things that were out there that I have not used before.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you so much, Pinky. Thank you again for joining us. Just to bring you up to speed, and you may have been watching while you've been trying to join us. Sorry for the technical difficulties. So far, we've covered critical path, some more extended discussion about what is the critical path and how do we use it. And also, I've kind of gone back and reflected on the tornado diagram and just helped identify some of the technical or the machinery along the way and the interpretation of it and how it might be useful in decision making. So that's what we've done so far. Do either of you have anything specific to add around critical path or around the tornado chart?
Well, I have to add something about the tornado diagram, because actually what really helped me to understand it is that the bars on the diagram represents the inflation of the project itself, not the change in the duration of the activities, but how it influences the whole project. If you get these concepts, so the diagram should be pretty straightforward.
Fair, and that's a fair point. To reiterate that the diagram represents the swing in the project overall duration, not in the task itself. So we're not representing just the variability in each task, but we're representing the overall effect on the project completion time. So thank you for that clarification. Okay, Leslie, do you want to walk us through the next question? Are we ready for the next question?
I think we are. The next thing that I noticed a few students asking about were cumulative probability distribution charts, which we have in our week 3 quiz. This is question 12 in that quiz. Deals with this topic. So Yael, if you could go over the distribution chart and maybe talk a little bit more about it and how it works, I think that would be helpful for students.
Sure, I would love to. I just want to, before I flip to my display here and to the slides, I do want to point out to all of those who have been asking questions around it, the tornado diagram, the schedule risk, interpreting a cumulative distribution chart, these are advanced, relatively speaking, these are advanced topics. These are, they're not always easy or intuitive to understand. It takes practice, like many other things. You have to view them often. You have to try and interpret them time and time again. You have to experience some of these ideas and try and make use of them until it really sinks in. And so give yourself some time to revisit these topics and to, now that you're aware of them, seek them out and ask individuals that you think may have worked with them in the past. That sometimes helps to see it in context, to see it in your business, in your environment, in practice. I'm going to flip again to sharing here a slide. Let me see that I do this right. Leslie, you see my slide now?
No, not yet.
Well, I hope that you can see my slide. Pinky, do you see my slide here that I'm sharing?
Yes, I see it.
Okay, great. So this is the cumulative probability chart from question 12 in week 3. Something similar was presented in the lecture notes themselves and the lecture videos themselves. And how do we interpret this chart? So what we see here on the x-axis is, again, as Evian mentioned, the duration in week of the overall project. I am looking to understand how confident I am that the project will be completed within a certain number of weeks. The y-axis, in this case on both sides of my screen, the y-axis tells me the same. This is a cumulative probability or a chance, okay? Meaning that the numbers, 0.1 is 10%, 0.2, 20%, all the way up to 1, which is 100%. And where the line, if I go up on the x-axis, for instance at 30, where I hit the line, if I go up as straight as I can, clearly my pen is not as straight as I want to be, but if I go up all the way to the black line and I read across the probability, that tells me how likely am I to finish my project up to 30 weeks. Meaning there is just under 20% chance in this case that I will finish this project within 30 weeks. The questions in the quiz, you know, there are a couple of versions first to notice, but one version also asks you what is the chance that the project takes at least 30 weeks, meaning 30 or more weeks. So we're actually asking for the right-hand side of the diagram and not the left-hand tail. And so if I wanted to conclude something about what is the chance that the project takes me at least 30 weeks, I need to actually complete to 100%, meaning over 80% chance that the project will take me 30 weeks or longer, at least 30 weeks or more. Okay, so hopefully that helps clarify how to use the chart. Pinky, Evgen, any other comments or thoughts about this?
No, I know that was one of the questions I missed the first time because I did it backwards, but I figured it out.
It takes some time. Sometimes it's helpful to draw another type of picture. I'm going to try and flip out of this into another presentation, actually from our slide deck. Sorry, I don't want to move too fast here on the slides. Let me see if I can zoom into the relevant slide. So another way sometimes to look at it is with not necessarily looking at the cumulative chart, but if you look more at the probability distribution directly, it's sometimes easier to look at, or for some individuals, it's easier to interpret by looking at regions under the curve. And so if you want to conclude, for instance, in this chart, how long it would take me to complete a project within 12 weeks, I basically have to sum up the area under the curve that takes me up to 12 weeks. Some of us are more comfortable to interpreting one chart versus the other, but ultimately they should end up in the same place, and it's simply a different representation of the probability distribution.
Sorry about that.
Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing my screen now, and hopefully, Leslie, we can move on to the next question.
All right, we had a question from Manuela, and again, this is in week 3, talking about the criticality index. So how do you get to the criticality index after evaluating the risks in a project?
Fantastic. So it's a great question. When we move from talking about just the critical path to moving to talk about an entire the critical path, the project duration, we move to start talking about a distribution associated with a project completion time. Then we start talking about chances of tasks being on the critical path. We no longer care about the original critical path because it may change, and so we talk about what is the chance that a task is on the critical path. I'm going to combine this question with another question I saw on the forums. in order to do the risk analysis, in order to do what I demonstrated in the slides, you need to use, or it's helpful to use, a tool like Crystal Ball, or an alternative would be At Risk. Palisade is the company and At Risk is the product. And these days, many many project management tools might have a Monte Carlo simulation tool embedded in them. Some versions of Primavera have it, I know, and many construction firms work with it. Once you have a risk analysis set up, meaning once you've taken the project and added the uncertainty around the durations, and you are able to simulate multiple possible futures of the project, you can also ask, either with an if statement in Excel, is this task on the critical path, yes or no? Or you can actually expect some of these software tools to give you that number, that critical index, after it ran multiple scenarios. So for instance, At Risk, which is a tool that I use quite often, At Risk has a component for projects. And in it, once I run a hypothetical, multiple runs of a project and let it experiment with different durations, it will spit out, as part of an output, the critical index. What is the chance that a task is on the critical path, given the uncertainty that I have in my project? In the Excel spreadsheet that I've demonstrated this for you, I think one of the videos that we've supplied has a little demonstration of how I would do a Monte Carlo simulation. In that spreadsheet, you may have noticed that I can code the critical index as 0 ones with an if statement. All of the dependencies are in the spreadsheet. It picks up on whether or not a task is critical. I can code it as 0, 1, and I can simply look at, over 1 million of those iterations, what is the average number? What does it mean? How, on average, how often is it on the critical path? And so if you run 1 million iterations, the average, the mean that you get for each one of those critical indices is that probability, is that percentage. And so that's how you would calculate critical index, typically within a software that does Monte Carlo. Crystal Ball is just one of many. Palisade At Risk is probably one of the larger tools out there. And you would be surprised how many companies have it embedded within their project management software environment. You have to ask, though, because there's a lot of information in those systems. You probably need to ask individuals if they're familiar with how to do Monte Carlo simulation. Leslie, I think we're ready to move on.
Okay. Hopefully that answered the questions about criticality index. Related to simulation, there was a question from George about Crystal Ball, which we did mention in the course, but are there alternatives to Crystal Ball that students could use to run the simulation? Yeah, so as I said, At Risk is the leading one. I think that Primavera has an appropriate one. There are others out there, but these are probably the most common one and the easiest introductory points into Monte Carlo simulation. A lot of folks are becoming more and more comfortable writing simulation themselves, either in MATLAB, in R, in Excel itself. And so if you are, if you do use tools like that on your own on a regular basis, you could probably write some program to do it yourself. I would encourage you to look for some equivalent of Crystal Ball or At Risk. Both have trial versions that you can download and experiment with, and ask individuals in your firm whether they're familiar with their specific component that integrates with the project management system that you're using locally. Before we move on to the next question, I want to ask Pinky a question, if that's okay.
Okay.
You said that you have a lot of experience working for the government, you mentioned?
Yeah, I actually ran grant-funded programs. They were funded by the federal government. Yeah, U.S. Department of Education. So
we've been having several questions on the forums that I've noticed around, are there specific tools that either not-for-profit organizations, mainly around the not-for-profit kind of sector and the public sector, use that we should be taking note of? Because There is a slightly different focus. Maybe it's more on cost, maybe it's less on duration. Of course, that would depend on the specific project. But are there any frameworks, software tools, or anything that we should be aware of that are specific to that type of domain?
Not exactly. I mean, for of course, with the contracts and the programs that I work with, it's cost. Cost is the major thing.
That's what I thought.
We use, well, for myself personally, when I was running those programs, we used the Blumen software, which,
Okay.
you know, we put student stuff in there and all of those other factors. And a lot of folks just use Access, Access or Excel. So
Okay.
that's as far as that's as much as I know from that little world over there that was used. And as far as doing proposals and you know, submitting those sorts of things, the folks I work with just basically use the consultant for that. But you know, any of the other things that as far as performance, we usually got a download from the Department of Ed. You know, they had their own software, which was a nightmare. So yeah, it was crazy. But yeah, nothing that I'm aware of, you know, not from my experience.
I don't think it's that uncommon. Actually, one of the reasons we're probably getting the question is because I suspect that in reality, you're right. And most of the most organizations end up using something associated with Excel or Access, mainly because we are more comfortable using Excel. So we will gravitate towards using our own Excel spreadsheets, even if we have the most sophisticated system in place. And so Excel can be very helpful and creative. And there are add-ons that we can use, like Crystal Ball, that and at risk, that actually help us a great deal. But and this day and age, a lot is moving towards the more online collaborative tools. And so what I do know is that platforms like Basecamp, platforms like Trello, Asana, these are tools that are out there that are adding capability in terms of their the collaborative opportunity that they provide. And some of them integrate tools like Gantt charts and the critical path and planning projects. And so as we progress, I suspect that there'll be more and more offered on the web as a free kind of virtual tool, and less folks will be using their locally installed heavy software systems. Evgeny, do you have experience with any tool that we haven't introduced specifically in the course?
Sorry, I had some technical difficulties, and
That's
I
fine.
still...
You're back with us now.
Yeah, and I still don't see you, actually.
Oh.
But I can hear you, at least.
Okay, good.
Well, actually, in the university, we used to use just Excel, plain Excel. It actually can run Monte Carlo simulation using simple rand function. It's when actually you have small project or some coursework you need to do, Excel is just fine.
So that's the message is loud and clear, and I agree with you both that in many cases, especially the smaller projects, but even if it's not just a small project, Excel is a very robust tool. And yeah, using RAND yourself or to write some equivalent of a simulation to incorporate uncertainty is great and something that we can learn how to do within the Excel environment. So hopefully that answers that question. I'm going to progress, Leslie, with the list I have in front of me, if that's okay with you. There was a question around PERT method versus simulation, and I just want to talk on that briefly before we move on to a few other more general and high-level questions. PERT method was very common and is still used in many settings to capture uncertainty in the task duration, to perform a similar activity related to the risk analysis that I demonstrated. However, it is on one hand, it's simpler because we don't need a tool like Crystal Ball or even programming our own simulation. And there are formulas that we can use to calculate the expected duration of each task. But it is a simplified method. So it does assume at the end of the day that there is one critical path, and that critical path will derive the overall project completion time. It does allow me to think about the completion time as an uncertainty, but again, it makes certain assumptions, for instance, assuming a normal distribution, which I don't want to go into too much detail right now, but it does make certain assumptions in order to reach its conclusions. And while it's a valid method, and those of you who've studied it or are familiar with it know it's a valid and an important method out there, it is somewhat restrictive compared to what I think we can do with very simple tools these days. And so that's why I decided to recommend working with simulation or Monte Carlo approach. And given the limitations on the time that I could spend on some of these topics in class, that was my main focus. What do I believe is the state of the art and where we should be aiming with our project management? Clearly, if your company around talks in those terms and uses PERT, I can post some short readings that take you through the steps and explain how to do it, how to calculate your project completion time. And also, I'll post a little note on contrasting the two methods. So maybe that will be helpful to enrich your knowledge of where PERT slots in. There was one question on the forums that I wanted to bring because I think it's relevant to Pinky and to Evgen. So one of the questions was, how does project management relate to event management? And Pinky, you said that in the government or in your environment, you were restricted by cost. What about event management or event planning? How does that fit? What do you think about event planning versus running some projects that are constrained by cost? We can't hear. Hang on, Pinky. I can't hear you for a second. Can you hear her? I lost their video. Yevgen, are you there? I think we lost them. So maybe our oh, sorry. Go for it.
Concerning event management, I don't know. I don't think it's really different from project management. Like wedding is still a project, you know. It's the way you think, the way you call things. I don't think there is much different, but it's my opinion. I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong.
I tend to agree. I tend to agree with you. I think that it's another instance of a project. I think that the focus is on the constraining factors. So in event planning, you are planning to a date, and you cannot delay that launch date, or you cannot delay that date in which the event takes place. And so your priority is really on that date. You are likely either going to give up some of the scope or the cost, if need be, in order to meet that date. But in reality, it's a project. And so I agree with Evgen completely that an event, in my mind, is a specific type of project. There could be specifications. So once you specialize as an event planner, you're probably going to focus on planning events that have to do with crowd control, with transportation, with feeding individuals. So you might have a different set of components in your work breakdown structure, and you might become an expert on those. But it's a project like many other projects are.
Yeah, you actually take, words from my mouth. I was just saying that the main difference I see is that event management is mostly about time, constraint, while the projects is usually more about cost constraint. Right. So it's a slightly difference between them, but it's really arguable.
I agree completely. So hopefully that answered that question. Leslie, maybe one last question?
I have one last question here that's pretty specific. So in the forum, in the Google Hangout forum, we have a question about SPI and CPI. Should the contingency reserve for the activity be considered a part of its PV when the risk actually has to be mitigated, incurring costs? Does that?
Yeah, let me try and interpret the question as I understand it, and I may not completely be capturing what the individual meant when they wrote the question. Do the calculations of the SPI and the CPI include contingencies that were planned or incorporated up front? So it's a good question, and it's a tricky question to answer, because some companies, each company has their own policies around contingencies. In many cases, contingencies are thought of up front, added to the project plan, included in our cost estimates, and then they become an integral part of that. And therefore, when you do come to report on your progress and you report how you're doing in terms of your schedule and your cost, yes, the calculation of the SPI and the CPI will include the contingencies, or how are we doing compared to the total amount that we allotted, and how are we doing in terms of the entire duration that we allotted, including the contingencies. Now, you probably realize that there could be some danger there, because it could be that if we allow the individual to think about a task with the contingency in it, they will end up eating up the entire contingency. And so there is some school of thought, and there are gurus out there who would actually recommend that you maintain the contingencies at a project level. You calculate them and you think about them as you analyze your project, but at the end of the day, you include them only at a project level, and you do not include them in your ongoing reporting. And so the calculation of the SPI and the CPI will be taken with regards to the original plan without the contingency. That's probably what I would recommend doing, just so you give yourself some more flexibility, but that really depends on the organization. Yevgen or Pinky, anything else to add on that? If you've had experience working with earned value?
Well, yeah, I read this thread in the discussion forum, and I slightly actually disagree with the points in this forum that people answer. I really don't think that those extra money should be, like taken in account when you think about planned value. They are not part of the planned value, because you don't actually divide this money for specific activity. That's actually what you what you told us about in the election. You just gave them for the whole project, and it's a manager who is deciding how to spend those money. If you will decide, he will decide that he need to pay extra, or he need, for example, if some risk occur and you need to spend extra, you know where to take them. But those are not planned money, and actually, I believe that we should give the cost of the project in range, the same as duration of the project. So the project cost is like 1 million, but it could be a bit expensive and cost like 100,000 more if something occur, some risks.
I agree completely with your point. I think that the distinction is important. In reality, it doesn't always happen that way, but I agree with you completely that we should keep the contingency separate, and that we should conduct the same type of analysis and talk about ranges for our costs and not only for our distributions or our durations. And so start to think about the cost as an entire distribution, and think about any contingencies as something that the manager is in charge of and can distribute only when the time arises.
Yeah, and actually about those two indexes, scheduled performance index and cost performance indexes, they used to, as I understand them, they used to, know what the health of the project is right now. So not the performance of the team, how good is management, how bad is the management. It just, are you over the budget? Are you under the budget? Are you on schedule? Are you out of schedule? So it's actually, for me, it's not logical to include, your risk assumption into this. It's just about those indexes shows the state of the project at the current point in time. So if you spend more, you just show you spend more, and that's your project, that's the reality.
Yeah. I couldn't have said it better myself. I agree with you completely. These indices are a measure of health of the project, and only are helpful to inform decisions that may need to be made, but they're not anything more than that. I think that's about it in terms of our time. I really want to thank Yevgen and Pinky for joining us. I know that there were more technical issues than we would have liked, but that's fine. What we got was really helpful and useful. I want to, again, thank everybody for participating so actively in the course. I think that there's been a lot of rich conversations that we've learned from each other. And I learned a great deal from the responses. Thank you for engaging in the case studies. I again thank Leslie for being so on the ball with responding to the forum and keeping track of what's going on. Today's the last day for the extended signature track sign up. So if you're still interested in signing up for the signature track, we had one deadline before. We extended it by a week thanks to the Coursera. But I think that today's the day. So if you do want to get a signatured or verified certificate with your identity, go ahead and sign up for that. You have 2 more weeks to complete all the quizzes. You can still access the course material until the end of May. So please feel free to do that. The forums are still active. We're still here, even though new material is not being released. And encourage people to join us. The more we hear from you, the more folks we get to reach and get to know. It enriches our conversation in our lives. There's LinkedIn groups and Facebook and a very active social group going on. So reach out if you want to take part. And again, just thank you from me. It's been a really exciting experience. Thank you. Bye. Bye, everybody.